Hey everybody, Steve Winward here. If you've been following some of my technical videos, this is going to be a little bit different from the low-code Power Platform Dynamics 365 videos I've been doing up until this point. In a prior life, I was a professional software developer, and so I still like to do that on the side for fun hobby projects every once in a while. And what I wanted to share with you today was something I struggled with finding good documentation on. So I wanted to share with you all. I made an open source repository, and then I also made this video to kind of walk through what I'm about to show you. So the actual solution I'm going to show you are Azure Functions, but specifically, they recently added support for .NET 5 with something called the isolated process hosting model. Effectively, what this means is that you're no longer coupled to these really tight SDKs. And so in the future, what you can do is you can update your .NET version much faster with Azure Functions than you could previously. That's the benefit here. The challenge I found was that I had a prior project that was .NET Core 3.1, and I had GitHub Actions set up to do automatic continuous integration and deployment of my application into Azure. When I upgraded to .NET 5 with the isolated process, I was struggling to figure out how to do that with GitHub Actions. So I wanted to share that with you. Now, full disclosure, this video is a little bit longer than my normal videos. I don't expect people to watch this entire video. Instead, what I've done is I have a table of contents so you can go to different chapters that you want to. If you're already comfortable with GitHub Actions, you may just want to go to my GitHub repository that I'll share in the links below, and you can look at the sample YAML files. But the other thing I wanted to explain is that I do have two different workflow samples, and I'm going to go over both of those in this video. The first one is going to be using the actual Azure Functions GitHub action. That's the recommended approach. But as I was troubleshooting this for this video, I did another approach, which I would say is more lower level. That second approach, what I'm doing is I'm actually installing the Azure Function Core tooling through GitHub Actions using Node.js. And then once that's installed, actually calling the Azure Function command line tooling to publish to Azure. Each of these methods, they have different authentication methods. But I thought it would be interesting. If you're not as familiar with GitHub Actions, this will actually be an interesting deep dive to get a little bit more familiar with how they work and how you can actually troubleshoot them yourselves. And then the first thing I'm going to show you here is actually this working end to end. So I'm going to pull up Visual Studio and I'll show you my Azure function. I'm going to make a really quick change to that, and we'll see in minutes it actually then propagate out to Azure through the GitHub action. All of this is with .NET 5 with the isolated process model. So what I want to show here is I've got the Azure function already deployed with .NET 5 running as an isolated process. And we're just going to test this really quickly. So I'm going to get the URL. I'm going to run that in a new tab, and we can see it's a very simple HTTP response. Welcome to Azure Functions. What I want to show is just how easy it is to make changes locally and then push those and have them automatically get deployed. And then I'll walk through the details of how I set that up. All right, so I'm in Visual Studio. I'm going to take a look at the function. And initially it said, welcome to Azure Functions. I'm going to say, welcome to Azure Functions from YouTube. And I'll go ahead and commit and push. Now what we can see is that there's already a GitHub action that fired, and we can actually watch this build and deploy in real time. So we can see that it'll run through a series of steps here. It's restoring the NuGet dependencies right now. It's now going to run the unit test project. The unit test passed. And now it's going to actually deploy the Azure function that we've recompiled. So this is automatically taking the build output that we have running in the GitHub action, and then it's going to automatically deploy that over to my Azure function in Azure. Great, so we're all done. So let's switch back over to the Azure portal and see what the result looks like on the Azure function now. All right, so I'm back at that same function. We just updated. Let's go ahead and get the URL one more time. And we'll go ahead and open up a new tab. And there we go. Welcome to Azure Functions from YouTube. So what I think is really cool here is that in a matter of minutes, we went from changing code locally in Visual Studio to pushing that to GitHub to automatically compiling, testing a series of unit tests, and then deploying that to Azure automatically. So what we're looking at here is the GitHub repository that I've made available so that you can get started with this really quickly. So in the source is just that very simple function app that we've walked through and kind of that overview. There's also a unit test project as well. And then if you go to the main README, there's a series of steps to kind of get you started with this really quickly, as well as some links to our public documentation on the .NET 5 isolated process and setting that up with Azure Functions. I've also got some setup notes here so you can get started by cloning or forking this repository. You can also then create a local.settings.json file. By default, there is a gitignore setting that does not get this pushed into source code. So if you do download this, you do want to create that file locally in your function app so that you can run that locally correctly. And then in terms of deploying this with GitHub Actions, I've actually given you two options here. One is with the out-of-the-box Azure Functions GitHub Action, and that's actually the recommended approach, and I'll show you how that's working in a second. But I also have a second option here, and this is more just if you're interested in how GitHub Actions work, this will show you downloading the Azure Function Core tooling and then using that to publish the Azure function. So that's a little bit more low level, but I think it's interesting to see how that behaves as well. So first what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the action, which is using the Azure Function GitHub action that you can import really easily. So this is the first one here, and we can kind of take a look at the setup, and I'm going to walk through a couple of things. If you're not familiar with GitHub Actions, I think it's really interesting to just understand how this works. The first thing is there is this section which is saying, how is this going to get initiated? In this case, it's on a push to the main branch. I'm also ignoring any changes to the README file. So when I make documentation changes, I don't need to kick off another deployment. And I'm also saying that anytime a YAML file or any one of these GitHub Action workflow files gets changed, I don't want that to kick off a deployment either. And then also for pull requests, we'll go ahead and make that kick off a deployment as well. This step right here, workflow dispatch, what that is telling GitHub is that you can manually kick this off. If you didn't have it here, when you went to GitHub Actions, you would not be able to manually kick off a deployment. I like to have it there so that as I'm testing, I can just kick it off really easily rather than having to push something into my main branch to kick it off. I've got a couple of environment variables getting defined here. This is the actual name of the Azure Function resource. If you go into the Azure portal, you'll see that this is actually the name of the resource right here, .NET 5-test-app. That matches this environment variable here. The next one is the path to the function app. In this case, at the root of source code, I've got a src, a source folder, and then the sample.functionapp project lives inside of that. I've also got another variable for the root solution path, and I'll walk through that in a second. Now, in terms of when this runs, what we're saying here is that this is going to use the latest build of Ubuntu. We're not doing Windows here. One of the cool things about .NET Core is everything can get built and installed and ran on Linux. And now from here, we're going to set up a series of steps. The first one right here is going to pull down the latest commit of the repository. The next one is actually going to set up the .NET process. And now notice here, there is an environment variable for .NET version. That's actually not defined. And what will happen is it's just going to get the latest version of .NET and the .NET process to do the next set of steps here. Now that that's installed, we can then call .NET restore, which actually gets the latest NuGet packages into the source code, getting ready to build it. And then here we're actually building this to get ready to run the set of unit tests here. So first we're going to build that with a no restore option, and then we're going to actually then run that and do the test. So any of our unit tests will automatically get run. And we're specifying here a working directory option. And that actually says where on the file path for this build server do you want to run this process? And that's why I created an environment variable for the root solution path, in this case, the src. So we start at kind of the root of all of the projects in the solution and go ahead and test that. If we had multiple unit test projects, this would run all of those unit test projects for us. The next thing that we're doing here is we're actually going to now specify that we want to build the actual function app. Specifically, we're going to do the release configuration, and then we're going to output that to an output folder. And in this case, the working directory is the Azure Function path for the project, not the root of the solution, but the actual Azure Function app project that we have configured here. And then lastly, we're using this Azure Functions action here to now deploy that. We're using kind of the same environment variables we had defined earlier. And the one that you'll notice here is this publish profile. Now, the way that you get that is you actually go into the Azure portal and you just click right here to download what the publish profile is. Once you do that, you can open that up. You'll get a text file. You can copy that. And then under settings for the repository, you can go into secrets. And if you didn't already configure this, you would say you want to create a new repository secret. In this case, I've already got this one here. It's the Azure Function publish creds. I'm going to update that. And then I'm just going to paste that value into there. And then I'm going to go ahead and update that secret. Now I've got that saved, and that's how that action works end to end. Now, I mentioned that I had a second YAML file to do this slightly differently. This one is a little bit different because we're not using that built-in Azure Function GitHub action. In this case, it's a little bit lower level. And I just want to show this as another example of how to use GitHub Actions, because I think once you kind of get the handle of this, you can really do whatever you want on the build server with GitHub. So in this case here, it's very similar to what we showed before. I actually commented out some of these things because I don't want two different GitHub Action workflows to kick off when there's changes, because otherwise they'd be conflicting with each other to deploy to the Azure Function app. So in this case, it's set up to workflow dispatch only, which means that I have to manually kick this off if I want to run it. Now there is a little bit of a difference here. Now, because we're not using the other action that we showed earlier, we're not using that publish credentials. In this case, it's using service principal authentication. It's using an Azure login GitHub action, and then we're passing it this Azure Creds function app. And I'll show how you can get that in a second, but let's just walk through the rest here. The other part of this is that when you're using the actual Azure Function core tools, it does expect that there's a local settings.json file in the directory. And what I'm doing here is I actually created a dummy build.settings.json in the project. And what I'm doing is I'm just renaming that on the build server from build.settings.json to local.settings.json to allow the core Azure Function tooling to work correctly. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Notice this is just a Linux command that I'm running here. You can really run whatever command lines that you want to through GitHub Action workflows. I also did something here, which is a command line tool called tree, and that lets me output before and after I'm doing the rename. I did that for debugging purposes, but what I think is really interesting there is as you're getting more familiar with workflows in GitHub, I think that's a really cool troubleshooting debugging step, because you can see at every step, if you add that run operation, you can see what does a file structure look like at any given step. And that for me was the easiest way to kind of debug this as I was building it. The next few steps are the same as what we had before. We're setting up .NET, we're going to restore, we're going to build it, we're going to run the unit tests, and then we're going to actually build the function app for release. And then lastly here, what I'm doing is then, instead of calling that GitHub action that did the publishing for me, here, first, I'm going to use Node to install the Azure Function core tooling. And then once that's installed, we can then run this command, which is the Azure Function app publish. These credentials are not going to be using the publish credentials that we downloaded previously. Instead, because we've already logged in with Azure with the service principal, we don't need to do authentication here. So it just uses that in the current directory of the function app. That's how that one runs. I wanted to show you now how you can create a service principal for the authentication for that second option that I showed with the YAML file. I think the easiest way to do this is to sign into the Azure portal and then run the Cloud Shell. If you've never used this before, it's pretty slick because you can actually run PowerShell commandlets right inside of the browser. So you don't have to worry about installing modules or different things to set that up locally. You can just do that in the browser. Now, in the README I've actually outlined, there is this script here. And so we're just going to go ahead and copy that whole script. We're going to go into the Cloud Shell and we're just going to paste that in. Now, as this is set up right now, that actually, we need to put a couple of different things in here. First off, we need the name of the function app. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give the service principal a name. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to name it a convention of whatever the resource name is. Whatever the resource name is, -sp. So we'll paste that right there. And because I had created one before, I'm just going to add a 2 at the end. So it'll be -sp2. The role here is going to be contributor. The next thing we got to figure out is the scope. Now, the way that you get the scope is actually pretty simple. You go to the URL and take from subscriptions all the way to the actual name of the resource. So in this case, .NET 5-test-app, we'll copy that. And let's go back to the script. I'm going to clear out what was there before on the scopes. And now I'm just going to paste in what I copied from the browser. And now we'll go ahead and run this. So we'll go ahead and hit enter. So what this is doing now, a couple of things. It created that service principal identity, and then it also gave us some credentials here. So I can go ahead and copy that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take that over to GitHub. And I'm going to go back to my settings, secrets. In this case, this is the Azure Creds function app. So we'll go ahead and update that. And we'll go ahead and paste that in. And now I just properly saved that into GitHub so that my action can pull that back in. Let's go to the YAML file one more time. And so just bringing this all together, the very first step here was that we were authenticating to Azure as a service principal identity. We're passing the credentials. The credentials that we're passing in are the ones we just pasted in. So just kind of end to end, go to the portal, run the Cloud Shell to generate what the credentials are, save them into GitHub as a secret, and then you can reference them that way. Thank you for getting to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this deep dive in Azure Functions and GitHub Actions, I would love to hear your feedback on this. If there's things you would like to see in the future, please put them in the comments below. And until next time, thank you for watching this video.